Now, before we get started, I want to speak of a 1978 case involving a 15-year-old named Willie Bosquet. Bosquet was charged with murder at age 15 and received what many thought was a light sentence. Willie Bosquet was born in Harlem, New York, to a father who killed two people shortly after he was conceived, and thereafter spending his life in prison. While growing up, Bosquet Jr. kind of wore this as a badge of honor, telling juvenile authorities that he would become a killer just like his father. And then he committed his first murder when he was 15 years old, shooting and killing two men during separate robbery attempts. He'd also killed a transport worker before police got to him. He was tried as a minor and given 5 years in a youth facility, a seemingly light sentence to many. The outcry against the sentencing led to the Juvenile Offenders Act of 1978, which ruled that children as young as 13 could be tried in New York's adult courts for crimes as serious as murder and charged as adults and receive the same penalties, receive life sentences. Now, this is just a case in New York, as there's nothing in the Constitution about sentencing juveniles. Just laying out an interesting fact before we continue. First up, let's talk about 12-year-old Eric Smith, who in 1993, when riding his bike through a local park in Steuben County, New York, 13-year-old Eric Smith bumped into the 4-year-old Derek Roby, who was apparently walking alone. Anyhow, Smith lured the small boy into a wooded area. He strangled him, dropped 2 large rocks on his head, and then sodomized the boy with a tree limb. Imagine 13-year-old sodomizing a boy with a tree limb. I believe he was actually only 12 when he committed the crime, 13 when sentenced. He was eventually convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to the maximum term then available for juvenile murderers, a minimum of 9 years to life in prison. He has been refused parole 8 times since 2001, and also, make that 9 times, refused again in 2018. Doesn't look like Eric Smith will be getting out of prison anytime soon. Now let's travel back to the 19th century to analyze a real psychopath named Jesse Pomeroy. The son of a Civil War veteran born in Boston in 1859. At age 11, he began luring young boys to remote areas and beating them, typically using his fists, his belt, even a knife. In 1972, he was arrested for these ongoing attacks and sentenced to reform school. The Boston Globe covered the story with the last line of the article saying, quote, "It is generally concluded that the boy is mentally deficient," end quote. Anyhow, 2 years later, in 1874, Pomeroy was living back with his family when he murdered a 10-year-old Mary Curran and then later just a 4-year-old Horace Mullen, and he hid their bodies in his family's basement. Good place to hide them. When the bodies were found, they had been decapitated by way of knife. He was only 11 years old when he started murdering. Pomeroy is found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death by hanging, although 2 years later the sentence was commuted to life in solitary confinement. Okay, now let's examine a 16-year-old who was sentenced to 241 years. A kid, Bobby Bostic, a 16-year-old kid. He was convicted after a brutal robbery in Missouri, where he fired a gun at 2 people, actually in 2 separate incidences. So he was covered by Owen Amos of the BBC News of Washington, D.C. in March of 2018, where he was interviewed from Jefferson City Prison. He says, because his father wasn't growing up, he says, quote, "We didn't have many role models. I was free to roam the streets. Therefore, at age 10, he started smoking and drinking. He was smoking weed at age 12 and PCP as well, and any other illegal drugs by age 13. At the same time, he would steal cars and ride in stolen cars. It was common for him. He said, quote, "It was a status symbol. That was our idea of wealth, a car that wasn't even ours," end quote. In court, he was offered a mercy of the court deal, a plea that he would have to take whatever the judge decides, and he turned it down. He was advised by his stepfather, who wrote him in prison. and he informed the young Bobby not to ever take a blind plea, because you never know what the judge will decide. Basically, you're pleading guilty, but you're leaving it up to the judge to decide. So Bobby said that he felt he had no choice. He said, quote, "I knew I was guilty of the case, but I always thought I had a better chance with a jury. As a 17-year-old, I still wasn't thinking clearly, but at the time, that's what I was thinking," end quote. Bobby went on trial and was found guilty of 17 counts, including 8 counts of armed criminal action and 3 counts of robbery. Before his sentencing in 1997, his lawyer suggested writing the judge, so he did, 4 times. Seemingly, this act only made things worse for Bostic, who reread his own letters a few years back saying, "I didn't show enough remorse," and also, quote, "They sound like a 17-year-old who doesn't know the gravity of the situation he's facing. That was the wrong thing to do, but no one ever told me differently," end quote. That's true. As a kid, you need to be told things. Anyhow, addressing Bostic in court, Judge Evelyn Baker told him, quote, "You write me these letters, how brilliant you are. How intelligent you are. How you are smarter than everyone else in the world. You are the biggest fool who has ever stood in front of this court. You have expressed no remorse. You feel sorry for Bobby," end quote. The judge then ordered Bostic's sentencing to run consecutively rather than concurrent, and the total there was 241 years. The judge continued, declaring also, quote, "You made your choice, and you're going to die with your choice, because Bobby Bostic, you are going to die in the Department of Corrections," end quote. Nice judge, huh? Talking to a 16-year-old like that. Bostic's accomplice, Donald Hudson, he took the mercy of the court deal, and Judge Baker gave him 30 years. Our next kid killer derives from Scotland. Aaron Campbell. Aaron Evil Campbell, from the Isle of Bute, Scotland, was a 16-year-old boy who snatched a 6-year-old girl. Alicia McFall was her name. Snatched her right from her bed as she was visiting her dad and grandparents on the island. This kid abducted her, raped, and murdered the girl, who was a mere 3 foot 9 inches tall. And then Campbell heartlessly dumped her naked body in the woods. It was determined that Alicia had 117 separate injuries to her body. Campbell was found guilty of her abduction, rape, and murder by a jury. Judge Lord Mathewson addressed the teenager killer in regards to Glasgow's High Court by declaring Campbell's wicked act some of the, quote, "wickedest, most evil crimes," end quote, ever heard in the courthouse. Aaron got sentenced to a minimum of 27 years. On the contrary, thereafter his defense attorneys appealed the decision, claiming it excessive due to the client's young age. A panel of 3 judges co-produced a new decision which lowered the original 27-year sentence, however, only by a mere 3 years. Now travel to Nottingham, England, as we mention this next 2011 case involving a teenager of 14 years named Daniel Bartlam, who beat his own mother to death with a hammer. After following the parents' breakdown of their marriage, he attacked his mother on Easter Sunday as she lay in bed. He used the claw end of the hammer and then doused her body in petrol, trying to destroy all evidence. He was convicted of murder a year later and jailed for life, with the recommendation that he served a minimum of 16 years. As in Europe, a life sentence typically means you'll be receiving parole hearings after only about 10 years, but the minimum of 16 years was recommended. The jurors heard the story of how he hit his mother 7 times with the claw end of the hammer before setting her body ablaze. The mother's body was only identified by her dental records. Nice son, huh? Next kid killer, overwhelmed with violence, is Craig Price. He was 15 years old when sentenced in 1989. This guy, Craig Price, became known as the Warwick Slasher for his horrific crimes. Undoubtedly a troubled child, to say the least, he became a serial killer by age 15, having killed 4 people in his Rhode Island neighborhood abode. When Price was just 13, in 1987, he broke into the house 2 doors down from his own, where he murdered 27-year-old Rebecca Spencer, stabbing her 58 times. Now, this first killing he got away with, never even becoming a suspect, not a bad feat for a 13-year-old kid. Now, 2 years later, now at age 15, he'd once again commit murder, killing 3 more of his nearby neighbors, while he was supposedly high on marijuana and acid, LSD. The victims were 39-year-old Joan Heaton and her daughters Jennifer, only 10, and Melissa, only 8. Each of them were stabbed over 30 times. 39-year-old woman, a 10-year-old daughter, and an 8-year-old daughter. That's unbelievable. Their wounds were so deep and plenty, the handles broke off of the knives, leaving the blades embedded in the victims. In court, Price mimicked the dying cries of the Heaton girls, never displaying remorse or any emotion in court during the trial. He detailed accounts such as biting the face off one of the victims as he stabbed her. He seemed to enjoy himself while in court. Price refused a court order to undergo further psychological testing, fearing the results would lead to him being committed for life. Instead, he was jailed for 25 years. Nevertheless, due to his extremely violent behavior behind bars, it is very unlikely that he will ever be released back into society. Okay, let's slow things down a little bit here with kid killer number 7. Number 7 on the list is Joshua Phillips. He committed murder at 14 years old. Back in 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison, and this was for killing an 8-year-old girl, Maddie Clifton. Phillips was allegedly playing with a baseball bat at his home in Jacksonville, Florida, when he struck the 8-year-old in the eye, causing it to bleed. And then Philip became panicked, fearing his father's reaction, so he strangled her with a phone cord and then stabbed her 11 times. And then this kid hid the body in his waterbed, where his mother discovered it a week later, due to the smell, I assume. The autopsy did not reveal any sort of sexual assault, but little Maddie's body was found nude from the waist down. The murder appears to have been motivated by Philip's fear of his abusive father, who would have been very angry if he found out Maddie got hurt at the house. Who knows? Yeah. Now, Phillips had no history of violence up until this point, until he was 14 years old here, but then he was charged as an adult. He was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I believe I have a clip here to play of him trying to apologize to the family members years later.
I wish to God that I could have known this or understood it when I was 14. Had I then, none of this would have come about. I had no clue what life meant, what death meant, nor the depths of suffering that could follow one act. I had no inkling of how long that suffering could last. I hadn't lived long enough to understand the time involved or what really suffering was. I did something horrible. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for what happened. Even now, after all these years, it is just unfathomable that all this could have occurred. It tears my mind asunder to know that I stole such a precious life from you. from the world. I so wish I could take away your pain. I thank God that I've been able to continue on in life and grow. But not a day goes by that I don't think of what led me to where I'm at. Not in prison, but in life. I pray every day that you're able to live your lives in spite of the injury I've caused you. I'm supremely grateful to have an opportunity of physical freedom. Yet any joy that arises in my heart is immediately tempered by the knowledge that these proceedings bring all involved once again face to face with the horror that occurred in 1998.
You can take that for what you will. I know a lot of people want to leave comments saying that they ain't buying this act. And certainly aren't buying the act of the story when he was 14. Of course, that seems a little ridiculous, playing with a baseball bat, and then he ends up stabbing her 11 times. But however, the apology now, it's, if it's not genuine, I mean, what is genuine supposed to sound like? He's been through a lot of suffering many years. And, 14 years old, your brain is just not developed. You don't know what's going on. Of course, there's no excuse, for murder. You can't make up for that. But, people need to learn to forgive. We forgive because God has forgiven us. Can 15-year-old kids truly be psychopaths? Consequently, Alyssa Bustamante was a 15-year-old insanely violent murderer. She once lured into the woods her 9-year-old female neighbor, one Elizabeth Olton. Thereafter, Bustamante strangled the young girl and slit her throat, not to mention the 9-year-old's wrists. Once the brutal act was accomplished, Bustamante buried the small girl in a shallow grave. Teenager Bustamante, whom was born and raised in Missouri, had a history of depression, self-harm, and suicide attempts. After the murder of Elizabeth Olton, she recorded within the pages of her horrific diary, quote, "I just fucking killed someone. I strangled them and slit their throat and stabbed them. Now they're dead. I don't know how to feel. ATM." End quote. ATM meaning at the moment. She later adds in it, quote, "It was amazing. As soon as you get over the, oh my God, I can't do this feeling, it's pretty enjoyable. I'm kind of nervous and shaky though right now. I gotta go to church now. LOL. End quote. Wow, this girl's insane. Making jokes about going to church afterwards. Elizabeth's mother, Patty Price, called Bustamante, quote, an evil monster, and she said that she hated her on the first day of the teenager's sentencing hearing. In conclusion, Alyssa Bustamante was tried and convicted of the first-degree murder of Elizabeth Olton at age 15. She was tried as an adult, therefore she received a life sentence, although with the possibility of parole. Now, as I continue my digging deep of sympathy for these violent killers here, in all fairness, Alyssa's mother was a drug addict who was in and out of her life, hardly even in her life. She clearly wasn't a good mother, and her father was in prison at the time of this offense.
Basically, the main reason for accepting the offer was to avoid the absolute certainty of life without parole. If there was another option, then there would have been no reason to have accepted that offer.
If she was in court discussing the deal to accept parole, as it appeared that she was going to get life without parole, but her attorneys fought that to the death, and she will have a parole hearing in 30 years or so. And who knows, when you're sentenced at age 15, you'll probably get an opportunity to parole out. During the mid-19th century in North America, in the year 1850 to be more precise, we come across our ninth child murderer in contrast to the 15 and 16-year-olds who many of you desire holding fully responsible for the heinous crimes of murder. We'll bring to point this short documentary speaking on behalf of one 10-year-old boy named George Green. This crazy little bastard had killed his own little sister Margaret. In consequence of his sinful act, he'd immediately articulate to his father, other family, and authorities that he bore witness to his little sister bitten and then dragged away by a bear. Howbeit, rejecting this elaborate tale almost instantly, his father and others proved this little George's view of events wasn't backed by any evidence. Quite the contrary. Upon further investigation of the scene, including the fence which the bear supposedly dragged her over, after George Green had his case heard in an Upper Canada courthouse, he was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to death by way of hanging. Just as a side note, prior to this case in Canada was another 10-year-old boy who was hanged after he was convicted of murder. In conclusion, the 10-year-old George Green was serving his time within an adult prison, whereupon this boy's death sentence was eventually pardoned on account of his youth. Nonetheless, he was to remain locked up with adult murderers when tragedy struck and took the boy's life. Green would die behind the walls of an Ontario prison at age 23, and we can only speculate how this occurred. Clear that I mentioned Ontario there, but I also mentioned Upper Canada. As you look at like 19th century maps, British maps from Canada, you have Upper and Lower Canada. Here, Lower actually appears in the green. Upper is more south to the west. Because of this reason was the flow of the Lawrence River as they entered through the Hudson Bay. So just to clear that up. Well, anyhow, there you have it. There's 9 crazy kid killers. What do you think? Did they deserve the punishment they received?